These dioramas may not appear to have much in common, but they're tied together in a complex web of world building and storytelling that I've been weaving for nearly 3 years. Aegis serves as the home planet of many of these stories, though the specific location for this particular build will be revealed later on. I'll show you my month-long process of conceptualizing, constructing, designing, and painting this model, and I hope you enjoyed the short story at the end. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. It felt cathartic getting back to concept art after not doing any planning sketches for my previous 2 builds. Admittedly, doing all this drawing and painting adds extra time to the project, but I find it helpful. On the one hand, it allows me to slow down and analyze the pieces I have on hand, envisioning new uses for them. On the other, it's a nice palette cleanser after weeks of working on the previous build. The subject for this diorama was to be a grimy pub, a setting that I'd never attempted before, and one that I felt would provide an interesting setting for a story. I believe it's that story element that makes dioramas and miniatures so universally appealing. Whether it's little kids playing with Lego or Barbies, or adults showing off painstakingly painted miniatures and terrain for a tabletop RPG, the common thread is often the presence of some sort of narrative. And even when a story isn't explicitly verbalized, our brains tend to build a story out of the tiny details we notice in miniatures. That said, this build was going to include plenty of intricate details, as the full interior would be visible, meaning lots of pipes, utensils, and kitchen appliances. As usual, I traced over my pencil sketch with felt-tip pens of varying thicknesses, then added watercolors. Water brush pens, which hold water in a tiny reservoir inside, makes this process much easier, and I found that using high-quality watercolor paint results in richer, more vibrant color. Unfortunately, not taking my time to carefully plan out a color palette led to a pretty disappointing finished concept, but it was enough for a starting point to progress to the next step. There's often a single piece that inspires a new build, and in this case, it was the undercarriage of this tank, which naturally resembled the underside of a bar's countertop. After slicing it in half, then using a jeweler saw to carefully saw away the unwanted surfaces, I sanded away the rough edges for an even finish. I also sanded the tops of these struts, as I wanted a bit of flatness here to make attaching the countertop later on a little bit easier. With the 2 halves cut, I used index cards to trace out the shapes needed to fill the gaps, then transferred these shapes onto thin styrene. By the way, if you're wondering why I often use my rulers upside down, it's because when used right side up, the cork backing raises the ruler slightly off the surface, making it harder to get precise cuts. That kind of precision probably doesn't matter for most things, but it definitely counts here. Carrying over one of the techniques I learned in my last build, I used Weld-On 3 to attach these gap fillers to the counters, then continued framing and gluing the rest of the interior walls, which would later become cabinets. I then tracked down this cylinder, originally from the interior of an old Nerf gun, and cut it down to create a garbage receptacle that would perfectly fit under this round bit from the tank. Once the walls were glued in place, I cut a strip of slightly shorter styrene, divided it into smaller rectangles, and attached these to the walls for the illusion of cabinet doors. This is absolutely a job for Weld-On 3, which gives you a little time to wiggle things in place before it dries and hardens. This would be a nightmare to try with superglue. With the 2 halves of the restaurant finished, I designed this counter, which would hold everything together. This was cut from 040 styrene, a bit thicker and more rigid than the previous pieces. Once this countertop was glued in place, I made sure all the edges were tightly connected with a generous application of Weld-On. For variety, the gap on one end of the counter was filled with these plastic tubes, taken from Q-tips, and small styrene panels helped to cover some of the model's gaps and holes. To bring the countertop closer to the height of a bar counter, I added some more styrene panels to the insides of the walls. With this building's quasi-Western vibe, I felt that wood should feature heavily in the structure's materials. So after texturing some more strips of styrene to resemble wood planking, I glued them to the base of the counter here. The most recent addition to my toolkit is these machinist's scribing tools. I'm using them here to add grooves to the countertops for added texture. Because the tips aren't super sharp, they don't quite cut as deep as an X-Acto blade would, providing for a bit more variation when it comes to scribing lines. Once the corners of the counters were rounded, I glued them onto the struts. Also, this was terrifying, but once it was done, I carefully sanded down the rough edges and attached more faux wood planking. Using leftover styrene scraps, I next crafted a stovetop, adding a little thickness here with a piece in the middle before gluing on the top. This plastic pipe thing seemed like a good fit for the appliance, and the height meant it could also serve as a support for the roof. To cover this gap, I added a few greeblies, which I believe are from an airplane kit's landing gear, but if I'm wrong, you'll see it in the comments. The base form of the rooftop was this piece from M41 Walker Bulldog tank kit. By the way, this is the same kit that contributed its turret for my little flea build last year. With the edge gaps traced out and cut from styrene, I covered them up, then began work on the details, like this giant venting and power unit. After sketching out the profile shape, I carefully trimmed away both halves with my jeweler's saw, then used weld-on to fix them into place. One of my biggest regrets with this project was not adding the battery, switch, and wiring for the pub's lighting here. This location would have been just perfect, and it was a major oversight that makes me really kick myself now. Once the gap between these two kit pieces was bridged with styrene, I made marks for the panel lines to match the side pieces, then scribed in the lines. I later decided that horizontal lines were a bit boring though, so I went back to redesign some more complex shapes. I also used a punch to add some notches to the edges, then glued this roof panel into place and was pretty happy with the result. There was a lot more measuring, cutting, and sanding involved over the next day or so as I filled all the gaps, even adding this ledge and lining it with a ton of vertical fins, which was a true lesson in patience. A lot of this work was inspired by Blight, whom I collaborated with in my last project. Working with other creators here on YouTube has really pushed me to experiment with new skills and styles of building, and has helped to level up my model making. Greeblies were next added wherever they seemed best suited, like this maybe coupling thing that made for a nice roof detail. Green stuff helped a lot here to fill in some of the angled gaps and uneven surfaces. Next, after taking some measurements of the roof's underside, I began filling in some of the gaps, this time with cardboard. I went with cardboard here because it would be a little softer, allowing me a bit of flexibility later when I needed to get the roof level. I used cardboard again here, which would serve as the vent hood above the stove. Next, for the roof's antenna fin, I glued these two wing halves together, then sawed away the unwanted wing flaps. I glued the exposed side down onto some styrene, then cut away the excess and filed. Greeblies were added where needed, and the whole thing was set onto a peg drilled into the roof. With the buns for my pub sandwich finished, it was time to attach them. I had a few different ideas to make this work, like using graphite cases or pen tubes, but I settled on these model kit trusses, which Scale Model Geek sent me in our collaboration back in June, and which I thought really fit the industrial vibe of the structure. To make room for them though, I needed to remove this counter section, and then I added some extra detailing with fine styrene strips so that the trusses wouldn't look so flat on their backsides. Everything was then superglued into place. My list of parts needing to be designed and 3D printed was long and varied, but I started with the pub's scaffold, first scanning the sides of my roof for an accurate footprint to design to. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that my go-to method for designing handrails, bars, and similar shapes is to first make the general outline with vertices in Blender, bevel the corners where curves are desired, convert the object to a curve, then in the curve properties, set bevel to object, in this case a rectangle with rounded corners. This allows for a lot of flexibility in editing, for example, changing the shape of this bar to something rounder or squarer later. This step was repeated multiple times for all of the scaffold crossbeams, being careful to match everything to the styrene scan so that it fit the roof perfectly later on. I also slightly recessed these vertical crossbeams, which would create a little more texture for the paints and washes to interact with later. Next on my list of items to design was the bar stools. I stuck as closely to the original design as possible, first making the seat, then using the same technique as the scaffolding, created the stool support, then the seat back, and finally the footrest. Next came the Ballbot, a friendly spherical robot that single-handedly runs this dining establishment. Their compact, efficient design allows them to handle any task required of them, from food prep to cooking and cleaning. Equipped with a vocal box and AI, they're also a source of news, information, and banter. More on that during the story. After creating the body, the antenna, and the arms, the shoulders, and hands, it was time to pose this thing. Rather than using the bone and armature technique I've used to pose human figures before, I instead attached each of the pieces at their joints using child and parent linking, so that moving one piece would drag the others with it. I then went through each part, including each of the fingers, and set their origins to their respective joints. While this took some time to set up, the result made it incredibly easy and fun to pose. If you'd like to try playing around with and even modifying this model yourself, I've made the Blender file available for purchase on my website, gameybuilds.com. If you'd like a physical printed version of my Ballbot, I've got a few of those in my shop too. And by the way, I'm clearing the shelves with a year-end store-wide sale. So if you're looking to get beyond the Blight patches, stickers, posters, or shirts for yourself or someone else, there's no better time than now. Check out gameybuilds.com while supplies last. It took a while to track down the base figure on which I'd base my cowboy-esque pub patron, the main character of this build story. I finally settled on this somewhat low-quality 3D scan of a sitting man, and to make life a little easier, I decided to print him in his stool. After sharpening the details as best I could in sculpting mode, I reposed his right leg to better fit the footrest, and then slapped on a bunch of greeblies, some of which had been designed for previous figures. Last came the cowboy hat, which was of course way too thin for a good print and had to be rebuilt with styrene later. Having been busy with so many other things since my move, these two boxes, sent to me from Elegoo, had been sitting in my garage for months. Inside were Elegoo's Saturn Ultra 4K 3D printer and wash and cure stations. This printer is absolutely massive, allowing for much larger prints than I was able to make previously, but more importantly to me was the Wi-Fi antenna, allowing for easy wireless printing, this rotating hood, and a rocking bed, which makes the prints peel away at an angle from the FEP plastic, meaning way less failures and much faster printing. After finishing and admiring these beautiful prints, I set up the wash and cure stations, also from Elegoo. While it's totally possible to just wash prints by hand and leave them to cure in the natural UV of the sun, it's been a huge time saver just sticking the wet prints in the tub filled with isopropyl alcohol and letting the machine do the work. The cure station is similarly easy to use and is able to get in all those hard-to-reach places. Thanks Elegoo for these great new additions to my workshop. After removing all of the printing supports, then sanding all of the prints down, I was able to glue the scaffolding to the roof section. I then recreated the hat brim with some thin styrene, adding superglue to fill in the gap at the seam. Next, to create the graded awnings, I used this wire mesh. The awning frames were designed in Adobe Animate and laser cut from chipboard, which allowed me to trace out the footprint onto the mesh. Once cut, I glued the mesh in place, then added the frame's uppermost layer. I repeated this process for each of the 3 awnings and was relatively pleased with the result. One of these days, I'll get myself a proper table saw to easily cut bases from wood and MDF, but in the meantime, I'm stuck cobbling things together from whatever I can find, usually decorative frames and wall art from thrift and dollar stores. Once these 2 MDF boards were glued side by side, I traced the perimeter onto some styrene, cut the styrene out, then sketched out a bunch of lines in pencil. Using these lines as a guide, I scribed them with varying tools to create a paneled sci-fi look. I then glued this to the base. All of the many printed pieces were then laid out on duct tape so that I could easily prime them with white spray paint. And with all this finished, it's on to painting and telling my latest short story. Enjoy. I find myself strolling uphill through a lonely alley bristling with paneled housing complexes and maintenance cabinets. I haven't got a wrist stripe on, or anything else to convey the time of day, but I guess it's early in the morning, judging by the dark sky and lack of people. I'm not entirely alone though, with rats scampering underfoot, wholly unbothered by my presence as they go about their rat business. But the most unnerving aspect of all this is that I can't remember where I am or how I got here. I'm comforted somewhat by the fact that this amnesia, if that's what you can call it, is shedding from me like scales of dead skin, so that little bits of memory begin to resurface. I don't know what this city is, or where I'm headed, or where I walked from, but I know my name is Fowl. I'm still working on the last name. I glance down at my lapel, where a stitched insignia stares back at me. An engineer's patch, I think, but this doesn't shake any of the scales loose. So maybe I'm here to fix something. Maybe I hit my head. Did I fall from someplace, perhaps? I gently pat myself down with my hands, performing a perfunctory examination. Everything feels okay. No aches, no cuts, no bruises, no islands of blood rising through my uniform. I do feel weak, though, fatigued even, as if I've been walking a long time. But that doesn't feel exactly right because I just woke up. I remember that now, too, and I toss that scale aside. I stop at an intersection and gaze up at the structures that rise into an inky blackness so dense I can't make out a skyline. No stars up there either. Just steel pipes and scaffolding and the soulless throb of neon lights. I'm hungry. I passed a Ballbot pub a while back and ignored it, even as the friendly AI-powered sphere beckoned from behind an empty counter. I see another one now, identical to the last, and the Ballbot hollers the same sales pitch as before. Rest your tired soul. Enjoy a Ballbot bowl. Creamy, delightful. It'll make you whole. I pause and consider the fact that decades ago in some stuffy corporate headquarters, a bunch of fat suits decided that their chef automecha would be more charming if he was programmed with an ingratiatingly cheery disposition. But I'm hungry. I make my way over to the dusty row of stools and slide behind the counter. I'm the only one here, and it seems I've just made the Ballbot's night. Exquisite. He has arrived at last. Ballbot's no longer alone and hope is on the horizon. What'll it be, sir? Bowl of your special, and a couple of bottles of whatever you've got. You've got it, it growls, in an apparent impression of my own voice, a trick I don't appreciate. I also don't appreciate the fact that none of the ingredients appear to be fresh. Everything comes from freeze-dried packets that must be rehydrated in a steam pump before they're added to the pan. When did these joints stop using fresh ingredients? I ask. The Ballbot doesn't bother turning to look at me. Its arms are a blur of activity as it snatches packages of sauces, works the stove dials, and plucks utensils from a row of hooks. Oh, it's been well over 200 years, the machine jokes. Freeze-dried is all we have these days. I ignore the bot's humor as he passes me a steaming bowl. I shouldn't enjoy it as much as I do. My tongue tells me the culinary experience is exactly what I expected, bland and mushy, but my stomach says to shut up and eat. I am glad to see you. You are the first customer I've had in some time, the Ballbot says, its cyclopean ocular gazing into me while I finish the first bowl. In this dense of a city? You're cooking that bad? I tease. The ocular flickers, a robot smile.
I'm afraid that these days it's mostly just rats in Service Mecca. I haven't seen an actual person in, well, some time. I stare up at the buildings around me, taking a moment to peer into the windows. They're lighted, but still. I catch movement in one of them, but the shape is too rigid to be a human. A cleaning automecha, perhaps. A dull orange light streaks through a row of one building's windows, then disappears. It almost triggers a revelation, but not quite. "What is this place?" I ask. In spite of the hot stew, an icy chill has begun inching up my spine. "Ah, you too," the Ballbot says sadly. "What do you mean?" "Memory loss. A common but unfortunate side effect. Very unfortunate." "Side effect of what?" "A faulty sleep pod," says the Ballbot, and his voice is almost angry. My empty bowl is whisked away from me, refilled, and returned. "Sleep pod." And just like that, a wave of memories is regurgitated into my subconscious. That may seem like a vile turn of phrase, but it feels like the most apt way to describe bringing up something so bitter. This is a ship, I realize aloud. I return my attention to the alley, finally seeing it for what it is. It's no uphill street. The floor curves upwards in a constant slope so that it eventually wraps back around on itself. It's a spinning wheel, counterfeiting gravity. The buildings are the wheel's spokes, and this Ballbot pub looks just like the last one, because it is the last one. I've been, quite literally, walking in circles. "You put it together faster than most. Hippocampal degeneration is not a pretty thing to witness." "So there are others." "Were others. They're long gone." "Gone where?" "Out of the airlock, probably." "Stop it with the jokes." I'm surprised to hear myself shout, my hands clenched into fists so tight that my nails make indentations in the skin of my palms. "No joke," the Ballbot responds sternly. "Our cleaning automecha prioritize hygiene above all else. We can't have decomposing bodies lying aboard. The last thing we need is a crew member with the right expertise and enough of their brains left over to save this mission to suddenly fall ill." "They're really dead? Why?" "What is the human organism without memory, without identity, without purpose? The brain struggles at first to recover what it can, but eventually it gives up. Crew members begin behaving like lost children wandering through the corridors. They think they're being chased and hunted by automecha, which are merely trying to get them to eat and drink, to dress their wounds. Death doesn't take long." Mother of Aegis, how did this happen? "I told you, faulty sleep pods. But I feel like I'm remembering more, getting better." "Great! Maybe you can save the station then." I glance up just in time to witness that warm orange light streaking across the walls again. "What is that?" I ask. "Madris Falori, a star. Provides all the energy this ship requires for a price." "What price?" "We can't leave. No fuel, drifting in space, being pulled inexorably towards the nearest celestial body." "Surely there's a way. The ship's AI must be able to do something," I insist. "Not without Captain's orders. Not without your orders." I glance down at my lapel again, struggling to make sense of the Ballbot's words. Did I misread the insignia? Does it belong to the engineering station or avionics? Is this a captain's uniform? I can feel the scales reforming, hardening over these realizations, calcifying. "For what it's worth, Captain, it was a pleasure serving on this vessel," the Ballbot says with a respectful nod. "Another bowl of stew?" But I have no idea what this creature is.
Thank you all so much for watching. If you're interested in getting weekly behind-the-scenes updates from my upcoming projects, sneak peeks at future merch, and the text and audiobooks for my short stories, consider checking out my Patreon page. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.